Okay, Spencer, over to you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this important session on the religion question in the 2021 census. In the UK, we conduct a decennial count of the entire population of the country at the location where each person usually lives. By now, most of you will have had a mauve card through your letterbox informing you that the census is coming on Sunday, the 21st of March. The results help to inform the government on how to develop its policies, particularly to plan public sector services and decide on the appropriate level of funds to allocate to different programs and groups. The questions vary over time, reflecting changes in the economy and in society. And as a generalization, there's been a shift from recording only the physical fabric of British society to recording its social composition. From the addition of household amenities 70 years ago, qualifications, migration and household tenure 60 years ago, and ethnic group and central heating 30 years ago, we moved to the important addition of the question on religion on the main census form 20 years ago. The question provides the best data we have ever had access to about the Jewish community, since until then we had to rely on sample rather than population data. And when the results of the 2021 census become available, we should have results from 3 consecutive censuses and an important time series where we can look at significant trends within our community. Who better to discuss how invaluable this new data will be than Dr. Jonathan Boyd, the Executive Director of the JPR, the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, a London-based independent research centre and think tank that provides data and policy insight on contemporary Jewish issues for organisations working to support Jewish life in Europe. Its research aims to provide a better understanding of who Jews are and what they feel, think and do in order to help Jewish organisations plan more efficiently and effectively for the future. A specialist in contemporary Jewry, Jonathan holds a doctorate in educational philosophy from the University of Nottingham and a BA and MA in modern Jewish history from University College London. He was formerly a Jerusalem Fellow at the Mandel Institute in Israel and has held professional positions in research and policy at the JDC International Centre for Community Development in London and Paris, the Jewish Agency for Israel in London and New York, and the UK-based United Jewish Israel Appeal and Holocaust Educational Trust. His writings have been published in various newspapers, publications and journals. His current work focuses on British Jewish demography and sociology, anti-Semitism in Europe, Jewish educational philosophy, and the dimensions of Jewish peoplehood. This session is being live streamed on several platforms, US TV, Zoom and YouTube, and each should give you the opportunity to submit questions, which Dr. Boyd has kindly agreed to answer after his presentation.
Thank you, Spencer. It's lovely to be here. Thank you also to Phil for facilitating all of this. It's really lovely to be here with Edgeware Shul and indeed I think the wider United Synagogue community. I really appreciate the invitation, which came I think about 18 months ago. And at that time we knew nothing of pandemics and assumed that I would actually be standing in the shul presenting this to you in person, but obviously we don't live in that world anymore. Let me share my screen and I'll run through my presentation, and then as Spencer said, very happy to take questions at the end. So just give me a second here and I will do that. There we go. Okay. Let me just start. I mean, in a sense, it sort of repeats a little bit of what Spencer just said, but just what is the national census? The first thing I would say about it, it is by far and away the largest and most extensive research exercise in the UK. As Spencer said, it takes place every 10 years, always in the year ending in 1, which of course we are in right now. It is compulsory for every household in the country to complete under law. If you don't complete it, you do get followed up and you may even be fined. The census actually it involves 3 separate operations. There's one census conducted by the Office for National Statistics in England and Wales, but there's also a census in Scotland and Northern Ireland going on at the same time, although actually this year the Scotland one has been delayed for a year because of the pandemic. And essentially, the census asks every household to record details of the household members living in their property on a particular given day. And this year, again, as Spencer said, it's that day is 21st of March, 2021. So in just under 3 weeks' time. The data that are generated from the census are used for planning and resource allocation at all levels of government, by health and education bodies, by civil society organizations, by business. The census really generates data that's used by everybody. But there is a very particular Jewish interest in it that's emerged really since 2001, because in 2001, for the first time, the census included a question on religion, and that therefore allowed people to identify as Jewish, and that created, again, as Spencer said, an extraordinary detailed data set about Jews in this country, the like of which we have never seen before. And indeed, we're very lucky to have, because most Jewish communities around the world do not have access to census data, including America, which doesn't have a religion question in the census, or France, the largest Jewish community in Europe, also doesn't include religion data in its census. So we're very lucky to have these data. Let me just start by showing you the question. So this is it. I hope people can see it. It's a question that will appear on the form. It's very simple. What's your religion? And you can see there are a number of different boxes there. You can say, I have no religion. I'm Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, or if you want, you can write in another religion. Important to know that this is a voluntary question. So just before this was introduced to the census in 2001, it was considered to be a rather contentious question, perhaps a little personal, and therefore at the time it was the only question in the census that is voluntary. All other questions one is obligated to complete. This one you do not have to. The truth is, in this current census in 2021, there's another voluntary question about gender identity that's been introduced. But certainly in 2001 and 2011, this was the only voluntary question. And essentially what people are invited to do here, and what I want to encourage people to do here, is to tick the Jewish box. Now, in very, very simple terms, what has the 2001 and the 2011 census given us in terms of data on religion? Just the very simple data that this generates. So here's a quick picture of what's happened in terms of religious identity in Britain between 2001 and 2011. The columns in blue are the data from 2001, the columns in orange are 2011, and you can see, I think quite interestingly, that in 2001, 71.8% of the population of England and Wales said they were Christian. 10 years later, that proportion had dropped to 59%. This time round, it's expected to be around 50, possibly even below 50. So we can see very clearly a declining Christian population. In the next group, we can see other religions, and within them are Jews. And you can see that the proportion of people who are a member of another religion, whether it's Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, Hindu, Buddhist, or something else, rose from 5.8% to 8.4% over that 10-year period. I think one of the other big interesting trends that happened between 2001 and 2011 is the people who ticked none, I have no religion, which rose from just under 15% to 25% in a 10-year period. You can see very clearly the growth of secularism or atheism across the UK population. And then the last group, both very similar figures, around 7-8%, are the people who didn't tick any box. They didn't answer the question, as I said, because it's optional. Let me focus in very quickly on other religions. And this is kind of what happened among those other religions. Here we're not looking at percentages, we're looking at numbers, and these are in millions. So one of the things that's very striking is that the Muslim population between 2001 and 2011 climbed from 1.5 million to 2.7 million. The Hindu population climbed from about 600,000 to 800,000. The Sikh population from about 300,000 to 400,000, the Buddhist population from about 100,000 to 200,000, and others, I've rounded the figures here, so they both come out as 200,000, but actually you can see there's growth among other religious groups as well. In fact, the only religious group that didn't grow over that period, or if it grew very, very slightly, is the Jewish population. And there are around 300,000 Jews in the UK today, and there were in 2001, and there were again in 2011, and we're expecting the number to be rather similar this time round as well. So those are really, really basic numbers. That just tells us how many people ticked each of those boxes I showed you beforehand. But the census data, or the census, is a million times more interesting and useful than simply giving us population counts. And it's a sort of actually kind of little understood point, but it's really very, very important. Because what we can do with census data is we can take all of the people that tick the Jewish box and look at how they answer all of the other questions in the census. So we can look at where Jews live, how old Jews are, the gender structure, how healthy Jews are, information about their living standards, social equality, what the makeup of people's households are, how large their households are, whether they're comprised all of Jews or of mixed Jews and non-Jews, who people are married to, if they're married, if they're partnered, if they're in civil partnerships. There's information there about their ethnicity. There's information about where people were born and what passports they held, information about their highest educational achievement, about their working status, their employment status, etc. So what we get from the census is all that sort of information about the Jewish population. And as I said earlier, and as Spencer also said, we have, before 2001, we simply never had data of this kind, anything even approaching data of this type. In 2001, just to let you know, 259,000, almost 260,000 Jews ticked the Jewish box in England and Wales. Across the United Kingdom, it was 266,000. In 2011, very similar number, 263,000 in England and Wales, 271,000 across the whole country. As I said, this is a voluntary question, so we know that that is not the entire Jewish population, but having done quite a lot of work on it and written various academic articles about it, we know that that's about 90% of the Jewish population. So the UK Jewish population is around the 300,000 mark, as I said before. What I want to do in this presentation is just to focus a little bit on some of these areas, and I'll touch on the top few: geography, age and gender, health, living standards and social equality, partly to show you the kinds of data that are generated from the census that I think are just of general interest if you want to understand the British Jewish population today. But also I want to show you a little bit about how these data are used for community planning purposes, because I think that's a critical piece of the value of the census to the Jewish community. So let me start with a little bit of information about geography. So here's a chart with a lot of information and a huge load of numbers, but these are the 25 largest Jewish populations in England and Wales by local authority district, or borough, if you like. And if you look at them, I'm just have to move the thumbnail out of the way so I can actually see my own screen. If you look, for example, at the top one, so we're looking at the borough of Barnet. That's the area with the largest Jewish population in the country by some distance. And you can see in 2011, there were 54,000 Jews living in Barnet. In 2001, there were fewer, there were 46,000. The next column shows you how much the Jewish population increased in Barnet between 2001 and 2011 by 7,398. And then in the right-hand column, the proportionate increase. So the population grew by 15.8%. And you can see that for each of the areas. And just to go into a little bit more detail on this table, we don't have time to talk about it in depth, but if you look at the two places highlighted in green, the London Borough of Hertsmere towards the top and St Albans at the bottom. Hertsmere is places that will be very familiar to people on this call. Bushey, Elstree, Boreham Wood. You can see that the Jewish population in that area grew over that 10-year period by 33%. And in St Albans, which is sort of pretty well next door, again, the population there grew by 40%. So we can see here where very clearly, at least by local authority district, where Jewish populations are growing. At the same time, if you focus on those places in blue, so Harrow, Redbridge, Enfield and Brent in London, but also outside of London, Leeds, Brighton, Liverpool, Southend. You can see in all those cases, if you look at the right-hand column, we're looking at Jewish populations that declined in those areas by sort of 20, 30%. So again, we can see where Jewish populations are in decline. The ones highlighted in yellow, I think, are of particular interest. I probably don't need to tell anybody what this means, but if we focus in on Hackney, think Stamford Hill, or Salford in Manchester, or Gateshead in particular, Haringey, which is right next to Hackney. Here we're looking at Haredi populations on the whole, and if you look at the right-hand column, you can see that these populations grew by 30, 40, 50, in the case of Gateshead, by 92% over a 10-year period. So massive growth. And we get some really important indicators, which I'll touch on again in terms of Haredi population growth from these data. Now, everything I've shared so far is just local authority district level data, so at borough level. But let me just show you a little bit more about what you can do with census data. So this is a map of the borough of Barnet. And I said before, this is from 2011 census data. I said before there were 54,000 Jews living in Barnet. Of course, Barnet is divided up into wards. You know that from local elections, and there are 21 of them in Barnet. And we can actually get this data from the census, how many Jews live in each ward. So here you can see the numbers and where the population is larger or smaller in different parts of Barnet. We can go down a level further, which is called super output area mid-level, and now we've divided Barnet into 41 different areas. And again, we can get information about how many Jews live in each of these areas. We can go a level deeper further, a level more detailed further. This is now super output area lower level. There are 211 different areas in Barnet that we can identify here. And actually we can go down a level further. This is called output area level, where we've divided Barnet up into 1,047 different areas. We're now kind of talking about, a handful of streets in each of these. And we can see very accurately how many Jews live within each of these areas. So these kind of the census data are just extraordinarily detailed. And what does this mean? What can you do with this sort of data? Well, this is one of the maps that we have generated and used at various different points. It's a map, as you can see, of London and the area to the east and the northwest of London, and it gives us a very clear sort of Jewish population density map. We can see exactly where the Jewish population is largest and smallest, and etc. And we get a very clear picture. And of course, you can do this for the whole country. We can also, because we have data from 2001 and 2011, we can see population change. So in this map, which is based on I'm trying to remember what level we're at here. Not important, but anyway. But in this map, you can see that there are certain areas shaded in blue, certain areas shaded in red. The darker the shade of blue, the more the population has grown in that place. The darker the shade of red, the more it's declined. So we get a real sense here of what's happening amongst the Jewish population. I said at a national level, the figures have remained more or less steady between 2001 and 2011, around the 300,000 mark. But when you see a map like this, you can see there's so much churn, and certain areas there's Jewish population growth, certain areas there's Jewish population decline. And of course, this is very important when it comes to thinking about where should we build new facilities, where are we likely to see decline, where should we think about closing down facilities. This kind of information feeds into all of those sorts of policy decisions. And to give you a very concrete example, and one that you'll be familiar with because it's about a shul that's down the road from Edgware. This is a piece of work that we did for Stanmore United a few years ago. And you can see it's a map of sort of the Edgware area, Stanmore, Cannons Ward, Burnt Oak, that sort of area. Right in the middle of that map is Stanmore Shul. You can see it there. It's a little black box with a Magen David at the top of it. And what we essentially did for them, for their own kind of communal planning purposes, is we figured out using census data how many Jews live within half a mile and a half of their front door. And they've used this to kind of, think carefully about planning and what their potential market is and how many Jews live within their area. And of course, these are just numbers, but you can also use census data to figure out how old these people are, how educated they are, what their economic circumstances are, etc. So all this data can feed very effectively into local community planning, and the shuls and schools, a number of shuls and schools have utilised it for that purpose. Let me move on to age data. This is a population pyramid. I don't know how familiar people are with population pyramids, but they're one of my favorite tools to use. Just to explain them very briefly, you can see there are a bunch of horizontal bars there. The part of the bars that are in blue represent males, in orange represent females, and you can see that the bar at the bottom corresponds to babies and very young children aged 0 to 4, and as you climb up the pyramid or the graph, you get older and older and older until you reach the top, and we're looking at people aged 85 and above. And essentially, the further the bar extends from the center, the larger that age group is in the Jewish population. And this is a population pyramid for the Jewish population of England and Wales in 2011. A couple of things to notice. There's some a good number of babies. They're actually quite a large group relative to other age bands. And the other thing I think that's important and interesting is if you look at the 60 to 64-year-old age band, and of course this is data from 2011 census, so all of these people are now actually aged 70 to 74. Those are people who were born pretty well soon after the end of the Second World War. And after the war, there was a baby boom in Britain, and there was a baby boom in the Jewish population of Britain as well. And you see it here. You can see that age band is larger than the age bands around it, and that is a direct result of the post-war baby boom. You still see it here in these data. Now, what's interesting about population pyramids is by simply glancing at them, you can tell an awful lot about the nature of a Jewish population. So here are a few kind of classic shapes of population pyramids you can see on the bottom left. So when you see, if you look at those 4 shapes on the left, if you look at the top left-hand one, you can see one with a very broad base and a thin top. That means lots of young children, lots of babies, very few elderly people. When you see that shape, you can see a population that will grow, that will almost inevitably have to grow and will grow at quite a fast rate. When you see the next shape along, the one in the top right of that box, you also see a lot of children, relatively few elderly people. It's not quite as acute. It's also a population that will grow, but not at quite the same rate. When you see the bottom left-hand shape, that nice kind of curved shape, that basically means a stable population. It's a population that will basically remain stable over time. And when you look at the bottom right-hand one, you can see there's a little bit of kind of reduction, if you like, among children. And when you see that happening, you can assume fairly confidently that that population should decline over time, all things being equal. So when we look at this population pyramid of Jews in England and Wales in 2011, I think it's probably closest to the one sort of at the bottom left. There's a little bit of growth at the bottom, but generally it's probably closest to a stationary Jewish population, and that's part of the reason why, by the way, we'd expect the figure generated from the 2021 census to be rather similar to the ones that were generated from 2001 and 2011. But here's when population pyramids get interesting. And by the way, I was chatting to Spencer about this earlier, and he was talking about what the population pyramid looks like for Bournemouth. You can generate these pyramids for any part of the country you like using census data, and they tell you a lot about not just about the population at a national level, but also at a local level. But I want to do something slightly different here, and that is to show you this pyramid, which is one where we have removed the Jewish populations of Stamford Hill, of parts of Manchester that are heavily Haredi, and of Gateshead. So what we're looking at here is the population pyramid of the non-Haredi Jewish population of England and Wales. And what's interesting here is you can see that the lower bars, the younger bars, sort of curve inwards a little bit. There's a little bit of growth amongst 0 to 4-year-olds, but fundamentally they are shorter and extend less far than the middle age bands. So when we think about the non-Haredi Jewish population, we can see signs of decline. If we now focus on the Haredi population as a whole, this is what the chart looks like. And if I was in a room with you, I'd probably be able to hear some of the gasps or kind of nervous giggles or whatever it is, because that's normally what happens when I show this. But you can see this is what the Haredi population pyramid looks like, rapid growth. And it's a very important thing to know about the UK Jewish population. One of the things that is happening is there is a major compositional change going on where the Haredi population is growing rapidly and the non-Haredi population, which is, basically everybody else, is slowly but surely declining. There are all sorts of shades of grey in that, but fundamentally that's the overarching picture. And again, census data allow us to see this and utilize it to understand kind of what's happening across the Jewish community. Excuse me. But then again, like, how are we using these data for community planning purposes? Well, this is a little chart that we generated for Jewish care, and we can use age composition data to project forward about what a population is going to look like. So these are data for Jews age 65 plus, and if you look at the columns in the pale shade of blue, we've got estimates of what the Jewish population age 65 plus will look like in 2011, 2016, 2021 today, and going ahead to 2026, 2031, 2036. And you can see, if you just look at the blue columns, you can see the Jewish population age 65 plus is expected to grow and grow and grow until after until the 30s, where it starts to stabilize and possibly decline a little bit. In this chart, we've also tracked what happens to 65 to 69-year-olds and 70 to 74-year-olds and different 5-year age bands. We're not tracking 65 to 69-year-olds on the top bar, for example, by people who are 65 to 69 now, but we're looking at the people who are 65 to 69 in 2011, and then the next group who are 65 to 69 in 2016, and the next group in 2021, etc. So what you can see here, which again goes back to the point I was raising about the baby boom generation post-war, is these humps that you can see, first of all in 65 to 69-year-olds, and then in 70 to 74-year-olds, and then in 75 to 79-year-olds, and 80 to 84-year-olds, is all over time a reflection of that piece of the age structure. But part of the reason why we did this work for Jewish care is, if you look at the 85 plus age group, you can see that the proportion of people in that age band declined between 2011 and 2016, is pretty stable at the moment. But once we get to 2026, we're going to see it grow. And the implications of that in terms of elderly care provision are very, very important for elderly care organisations to know, because it means there will be increased demand for their services as we move into 2031 and 2036, and they need to prepare for that. So one of the things we've tried to do with these data is make elderly care organisations, particularly Jewish care, aware of that, so that they are preparing for that eventuality, which is pretty well inevitable. We can also, by the way, looking at age data, look at the other end of the age spectrum. So these are data by these are numbers of people by different age bands from 0 to 18. Of course, this is data from 2011, so these are their ages at that time. But one of the things, just to give you an example of something that's quite interesting, if you look at the 5 and 6-year-olds here, this is 2011 data. So all of these people are now 15/16. So they are the cohort that is likely, assuming it actually happens, to go on Israel Experience programs this summer. And we can see how many there are of them. And you can see that actually we're expecting to see there's an increase in the number of children in that cohort. So we'd expect to see an increase in the number of people applying to those programs. Again, these sorts of data can be fed into all of those calculations and assessments of demand for school places, for summer activities, etc. And that's very much how they're used. Let me share some health data quickly. This is one of the questions that's asked in the census, is about whether people's lives are limited a little or a lot by a particular health condition. These are data for England and Wales, and we can see again by age how many people there are Jews living in England and Wales who say that their health is limits their life in a little bit or a lot. You can see obviously the numbers get higher and higher as you get older and older. That's not unexpected. But again, in terms of providing healthcare for different parts of the Jewish population, these numbers tell us an awful lot. One example of the way we've used them, we've just completed a piece of work for Jewish blind and disabled. They're looking at question of whether the facilities that they have to support people living with disabilities or particular health issues, whether they've got enough capacity. This is a look at how many people are living with limited with health conditions that limit their lifestyle in some way in the sort of bushy Elstree, Boreham Wood area, which is an area of particular interest to them. So again, we can create these sorts of maps so they can see where the scale of the need in any given area. This is another piece of work that we did for Langdon, which for those who don't know is a disabilities charity. Here we are looking at how many Jews there are in London. These are non-Haredi Jews living in London with different types of learning disabilities. How many there are age 0 to 4 with severe or borderline or moderate or light learning disabilities. And again, for an organisation like Langdon, thinking about providing support for children or adults with learning disabilities, this gives them the numbers. This gives them the numbers of how many there are, and where the need is, and to what extent they are they're covering the population that may need support, and to what extent there are people out there who they're not reaching. Quickly on economic data, again, some examples of this. This is like one of the things you're asked in the census is about home ownership. You know, do you live in a social rented accommodation, private rented accommodation? Do you own your own house, or are you paying a mortgage? And just to give a few examples here, you can see that the Jewish population in Hertsmere, 93% of people own their own house or are in the process of owning their own house because they're paying off their mortgage. Compare that to Hackney, where it's 38% and much higher proportions living in social or private rented accommodation. So we get these sorts of indicators of economic data, just to give you, I'm really scratching the surface, but just to give you an example again of how we can utilize census data for economic purposes. We're working on a project at the moment for a Jewish housing association that is working on building 500 new housing units for low-income Jewish families in areas where there are large Jewish populations. Jews tend to live in areas that are that are quite expensive to live in, and that means that low-income families, low-income Jewish families often can't afford to live there. So this is a housing association project that is that's looking to address that issue. And here we've used a combination of census data and other data about about various different Jewish organizations that we've also superimposed onto this map to show where the Jewish population is, where Jewish organizations and facilities exist, in order to demonstrate that this is the area in which it makes a lot of sense to build those kind of housing units, and hopefully they'll be successful in that endeavor. The last thing I want to say about census data is that we also use census data for waiting. That's not W-A-I-T-I-N-G, although we do spend quite a lot of time waiting for the data to appear. It takes a while for the Office of National Statistics to generate census data, but for waiting purposes, in terms of assessing and managing samples from surveys. So just to explain this in simple terms, when we run a survey, for example, let's say it was a survey of 1,000 people, typically we might expect there to be, I'm making these numbers up, about 200 people who are age 70 plus in a survey of 1,000 people. That would be the correct distribution based on census data. If we found in a survey that we run that we actually had 40% of people age 70 plus, we can use census data to weight our samples so that the distributions are correct, and that's absolutely critical in terms of doing any survey work. So again, just to give you a few examples of research work that's been done that's not directly using census data, but is using census data in order to weight samples of surveys. We've done surveys on British Jewish attitudes to Israel. We've done a couple of surveys for the European Union on Jewish perceptions and experiences of anti-Semitism. We did a big national Jewish community survey in 2013, which we'll be repeating in a year or two, on a range of issues about Jews in the United Kingdom. We did a study a few years ago about Jewish identity, what about the impact of different educational interventions on people's Jewish identity. What interventions, schools, youth movements, summer camps, Israel tours are most impactful in terms of people's Jewish identity. We've done work on charitable giving, and actually we're doing a lot of work right now on COVID and the impact of COVID on the Jewish population. Now all of these reports are based on surveys, but they're all based on surveys where we have used census data to assess the quality of the data that's come in and to weight it so that so that we can create a representative sample of the Jewish population. Just to give you a sort of a sense of what's happened particularly since 2011, and since the data have been made available to us, which really started to happen from 2013 onwards. There have been 30 different reports that have been published using census data covering lots of different themes: health, education, employment, elderly care, poverty, deprivation, charitable giving, Israel, anti-Semitism. We've used census data in all sorts of ways to produce those kind of reports. We've done 36 different commission studies for Jewish organizations, charities, trusts and foundations to help them plan for our shared future. I've shared a few examples of that in my presentation. I personally and members of my team have done over 100 presentations to different community leaders, rabbis, professionals, members of the community, national, local politicians, to help them see and understand the trends that we can see happening in the Jewish population and to help them respond accordingly to those trends. And pretty well every day we are asked a question by somebody about Jewish demography in the United Kingdom, whether it's from a community leader or a rabbi or somebody working for a Jewish organization or a journalist or an academic about what's happening in the Jewish population of the UK. And again, we draw on census data in order to be able to answer those questions. So much of what we know and what we're able to say about the Jewish community and how the Jewish community plans for its future is based on census data. And the fundamental message, I guess, of my presentation is this. On the 21st of March this year, you're going to be presented with this question. And the simple act of ticking this box is what allows us and others to do all of this kind of work, to understand what's happening in the Jewish population and to use the data to help planning for shuls and schools and elderly care organizations and organizations concerned with learning disabilities or childcare issues or mental health issues or whatever it is. These data feed into it. So my fundamental message tonight is please, please, please tick the box and encourage other people to do so. It takes less than a second to do, but in that very, very simple act, you are helping to generate a data set that is of extraordinary value to the Jewish community, sort of unprecedented value to the Jewish community. It's a very easy thing to do, but I can't even begin to tell you the impact it can have. I'll draw things to a close there, and obviously happy to take any questions that people have.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan, for a very informative and interesting talk. I can see we've got a couple of questions. People have put virtual hands up. As a reminder, if you want to ask a question, you can either put your virtual hand up on Zoom, or you can put a message into the chat and I will relay the questions. For those on YouTube, if you put a question into the YouTube chat, again, I'll relay any questions. So I'm going to start with Wimbledon Synagogue School Visits. At least that's the title of the account. So I've just unmuted you if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi, good evening. Actually, my name's Sharon Cousins, but I am part of the Wimbledon Synagogue School Visit. So here we are in South London, just to prove there are Jews in South London. If your chart had been a little bit longer, you probably would have captured London Borough of Wandsworth, because in the 2011 census, there were 1,500 people who ticked Jewish, although I suspect they were mostly from Nightingale Home. But we would have made the chart a little bit lower down. I just wanted to know two quick things. One, when will you have usable census data from the latest census? And would you expect to see changes like, for example, the community in Canvey Island popping up now in the latest census? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. The short answer to the question is we don't know exactly how quickly the census data are going to be available. I can tell you that in the case of the 2011 census, the very, very basic religion data, i.e. how many people ticked each of the religion boxes, came out in December 2012, and the census was in March 2011. And then more detailed data was rolled out over the course of 2013 and 2014. Now, there are two contrasting possibilities in terms of that timeline being different this time round. The good news is that far more people will complete a census form online. So there should be a lot less data entry work that needs to be done, and that we would hope would speed up the process. The bad news is the census is being run during a pandemic, and the amount of sort of follow-up work that needs to be done after census day to get people to complete their forms involves quite a lot of face-to-face work and knocking on doors and that sort of thing. And it's difficult to know exactly how that's going to pan out. But broadly speaking, it will certainly take a year, possibly two, before we really begin to see the results. And apologies for not going further on my slide and including more. It's just the PowerPoint only gives you so much room, and I went as far as I could so that you could actually see the numbers. But I don't think I could go any further. But yes, the bottom line is the same data exists for every single local authority district in the country. And one of the interesting things, by the way, that we found in 2011 was that there are at least some Jews living in every single local authority district in the country. In 2001, the only place where there weren't any Jews was the Scilly Isles, but in 2011 we even found 4 there. So Jews are interestingly everywhere across the country, although very heavily concentrated in certain particular geographical areas.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a few questions. I believe Jerry Lewis has sent questions to you on chat direct, or if you want, I can unmute him, whichever you prefer.
If you can unmute Jerry, he can ask his question.
Yeah, I guess.
Okay, I mean, he's yeah, so he said he sent them to you direct. I'll unmute, and Jerry, you can...
Jerry, can you ask your question?
Yes, I've got a series of questions. You might like to take them, say 2 at a time, allow other people to come in as well, if that's more convenient.
Why don't you choose 1 or 2 to ask quickly, and then we'll allow other people to ask as
yes,
well.
no, I fully accept that.
But what is your main question?
There's no main question. There are certain questions I wish to pursue with some vigor. First one, Jonathan, congratulations on your presentation and all the hard work you put in for our community. Why did you push away from the Jewish community's stated clear preference for the ethnic question for the 2011 census to now deny the stats for this year, thus making local council allocations skewed against the Jews for the future? Second question, if I may, how can you ignore the massive rise in the Muslim communities between 2001 and 2011, which you showed in your charts, and almost irresponsibly ignore our own figures based on ethnicity? Had we had ethnic questions, our figures would have been far higher and far more representative. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jerry. So first of all, I wasn't involved in the discussions about the ethnicity question in the 2011 census. I wasn't really at JPR early enough in order to be able to do that particularly. But we did make a recommendation for this census, by the way, in conjunction with the Board of Deputies, not to include a Jewish tick box in the ethnicity question. And the reason for that is I sort of hesitate to go into this territory because it is a very, very complicated issue. But in very simple terms, I can tell you the following. The ONS, the Office for National Statistics, obviously looked into this question in depth and took our view on it and others. But they commissioned Kantar Research to actually test out the ethnicity question among Jews in Britain. And to cut a long story short, and the report is available, they found that it does not work. Jews didn't understand why they were being singled out in the ethnicity question. They didn't like being asked whether they were Jewish by ethnicity. And actually, the most common piece of feedback was they actually found it discriminatory. So that's number one. Fundamentally, we found from that, and we found indeed from our own work on it, that the ethnicity question does not work very well. But the second point I think that's very important is the recommendation that both the JPR and Board of Deputies made pre-2001 was that Jewish should be included in both the religion and the ethnicity question. However, that wasn't accepted for whatever reason. ONS did a lot of work on it at the time, and full credit to them. They made their decisions based on empirical evidence, and they decided only to include Jewish in the religion question, not the ethnicity question. So that's what happened in 2001. The same thing happened again in 2011. And so we came to the point in 2021 where the question was, should we just maintain the system that had been run in 2001 and 2011 in 2021, or should we change it? And our view was, in the interests of data continuity, in order to be able to compare data from 2021 to 2011 to 2001, it was critical. And I say this as a social scientist with a very good understanding of this issue. It was critical to keep things as they were. Now, I understand the political concerns about it, but those were the primary reasons. As I said, I could talk about this issue in much more detail, and indeed, I'm sure I will, not least tomorrow when I've got a meeting with the Board of Deputies about it. But those were the primary reasons. And it's not a simple issue, and I understand the sensitivities around it, but that was our considered recommendation at the time.
The question isn't always exactly the same between the countries of the UK. I think Scotland asks a slightly different question. Could you say something on that?
Yeah, that's also true. So Scotland do ask a slightly different question. Actually, one of the interesting things about 2021 is that Scotland will be including a Jewish box in the ethnicity question. And part of our thinking was we want to watch very, very carefully what happens with that in Scotland, because one of the things that can happen when you move from a system of Jews or any minority really identifying solely through one question and then add another way that they can identify them in another question, it can affect the way in which they answer the first question. So if you create, we have at the moment we have a system where the only way to identify as Jewish is really by religion. You can write in your ethnicity as Jewish if you like, but the main way is through religion. But you have to bear in mind that if you include a tick box on the ethnicity question, it will affect how Jews answer the religion question. And that's the problem with data comparability over time. Now, what's happening in Scotland is they took the decision for whatever reason, and we very much didn't stand in the way of this, to include a Jewish tick box in the ethnicity question. And the reason why we didn't stand in the way of that was not because we thought it was a good idea, but because we thought it would be really valuable for the majority Jewish population in England and Wales to see what happens when that question is introduced in Scotland, in order to learn from it. As I said, we make our decisions on this on the basis of the empirical evidence, and the empirical evidence is very, very important to track. as I hope I've explained, the census data are so unbelievably valuable to this Jewish community. They really, and it's not just this community. The data set from the UK census on Jews is one of the greatest data sets that exists on Jews anywhere in the world at any point in history. So we are, very, very cautious, as I believe we should be, about messing with it. Because of the risks of doing damage to a data set that is just so valuable. So that's my opinion. I can see you shaking your head, Jerry, and I'm happy to kind of carry on the conversation elsewhere.
We'll come back. I know there was another question Jerry had, but we'll come back to it in a second.
Sure.
I've got a couple of questions that are both related to ethnicity. So broadly, given the way the survey is put together, when people are filling out the ethnicity box, British Jews should be white British or white other?
British Jews should tick whatever box they want. The ethnicity question asks, are you white? Are you black? Are you mixed race? Are you Asian? Are you other? And there are all sorts of subcategories within each of those. And British Jews, the vast majority of British Jews tick white or white other.
Okay.
But people should feel free to tick what they want to do. Just so people know, in terms of, does the ethnicity question expand the size of the Jewish population? So in 2011, 33,000 people wrote in Jewish or some version of Jewish in the ethnicity question. But of those 33,000, 25,000 also ticked the religion box. So it increased the size of the Jewish population by about 8,000. And there's no evidence to suggest that ticking that including an ethnicity, the Jewish box in the ethnicity question, would dramatically change that. It might increase it a little bit, but it wouldn't dramatically change it.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to David Landau, then David Grossman, and then take some more questions from the chat. So David Landau, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan. Very interesting. A couple of questions. Actually, one is more of a lighter question. The other one is hopefully you can answer with a great deal of information. The first one is actually that it's very interesting to note that the question on this census was, what is your religion? On so many questionnaires, particularly in schools, they don't ask a direct question. It tends to be, how do you identify yourself? Certainly in terms of ethnicity, even religion and sexual identity. They never ask a direct question of what are you? I just wonder why, I'm pleased to see that the census has asked a direct question. I just wonder why in other cases, they feel it's not necessary to ask a direct question and allow people a certain amount of latitude to actually possibly mention that if I wish to identify with Black Afro-Caribbean, could I actually answer that? The second point is, we have to consider where we are as a community, and as chairman of Edgware United, we've often looked at the idea of possibly rebuilding the shul, doing various works to it. The idea has obviously been somewhat mooted by a pandemic, but we've often looked at where we might be in 10 and 20, even 30 years' time. And what we've noticed over the years is that people move out from central London to the suburbs, and they've moved out further because as young people start in their jobs and their early marriage, the affordability for property within some of the areas where there are the mainstay of Jewish population at the moment, they can't afford, so they move out. Boreham Wood particularly has an extremely young demographic as opposed to many of the other United synagogues around. And I just wonder, within the information that you have gleaned, whether you can actually identify where the Jewish communities might be moving to over the next 10 and 20 years?
Both great questions. So the first one, I think I could go into detail about any single question, but fundamentally, the short answer in this forum is that when questions are constructed by any, I think, credible research agency, but particularly by the Office for National Statistics and similar agencies, they're constructed and tested and retested and piloted and checked, and and at the end of the day, you have to kind of give credit to the phenomenal statisticians at the Office for National Statistics, and we know a number of them very well, who do incredible work to check whether questions work or don't work, and in the end, they utilize questions that are most effective for the national interest. So there will always be a very sound empirical reason why a question is being asked in a particular way, and it will have been checked and tested multiple times. So that's the short answer to that question. In terms of movement and trends, so a couple of things. Often in research terms, we talk about the difference between stocks and flows. Stocks are sort of snapshots in time, and that's kind of what the census gives us. It tells us what the Jewish population looked like in 2011 and where it was geographically, and then where it looked like where it was in 2001, 2011, 2021. So those are sort of stocks. They're some kind of snapshots 10 years apart. Flows are much more of data that kind of tell us how things are moving over the course of time. So census data give us a much better, give us snapshots, but you actually need other data sources to really track movement of Jewish populations, and in that sense, kind of that's where survey data become more valuable. We can, to a certain extent, project what's likely to happen in a particular area, but it's quite difficult to account for migration in and out. It's much harder to do that. So quite often we find ourselves making projections based on the population as is, and having to caveat questions about migratory patterns within the country. Those are harder to identify, but nevertheless, I think typically when you have a sense of whether a population is growing or declining, and you can also gather information about movement, and often synagogues have valuable information themselves about whether people have moved into the area or moved out of the area. If you construct a project intelligently and carefully, and if there's enough budget to do the work that needs to be done, I think you can start to say something reasonably sensible about migration, as well as about kind of existing populations and whether they're likely to grow or decline over time.
Okay, thank you.
I think we were surprised in between 2001 and 2011 that Edgware was the only one of the top 10 wards where there was a slight population decline.
One of the issues with Edgware, just so you know, is that there are 2 wards called Edgware, and sometimes a bit confusing. So you've got to make sure you're looking at the right one. I don't have the data to hand right now. I probably should have looked it up before this session, yeah. And also, I mean, when you just look at when you look at the data by ward, you can also get a slightly inaccurate picture, and that's the beauty of the really detailed geographical data that allows us to kind of create the sorts of maps that we created for Stanmore, which go beyond ward. They kind of, as I said, they draw circles around a particular point and allow us to kind of to see not just how many Jews live in a particular ward in close proximity to a synagogue, but how many Jews live within a particular point on the map, and to do that those sorts of estimates much more accurately.
What is the lowest number we can go down to before breaching confidentiality? Because sometimes we have to aggregate figures, not to identify individuals.
Correct. I think it's about 30, if I'm not mistaken, and then the numbers start to there are all sorts of issues around confidentiality. I should actually, and thank you for raising that, I should say, and sometimes people are concerned about this, that the data might be misused in some way. I mean, we're talking about national data that are anonymized and very, very carefully managed. So there are this is a the Census is an extremely professionally run and managed operation.
I want to bring in David Grossman, who's been patiently waiting. So David, if you want to unmute your line.
Thank you, Jonathan. 2 questions. Given the importance of census data, will you actually be contacting individual shuls encouraging them to tick the box? And secondly, in your presentation, you mentioned about the effects of COVID and the disproportionate effects on the Jewish population. I notice when one actually goes for a vaccination, ethnicity questions are asked, but not religion. So are we actually missing a trick there? Maybe not for you, but maybe the National Statistics Office.
Well, on the second question, one of the things we are very strongly recommending, and actually one of the things we're seeing, is more and more agencies gathering data by religion. But one of the things we're really encouraging people to do, including the Office of National Statistics, but also lots of other agencies, is to include the religion question, because we know empirically that that's the best way to pick up the optimal number of Jews. It's a much more effective way of doing it than the ethnicity question. So part of our answer, I guess, to Jerry's question is also that it's, that is the most effective method to utilize, and that's the one we would most actively encourage. The first question, just remind me, it slipped while I was speaking.
I would say, obviously, given the importance of getting this data from the census there and ticking the box, will you actually be approaching individual synagogues?
Yes, thank you. I'm doing this session this evening, which is part of the outreach effort, and I understand it's being shared across the United Synagogue. So that's part of the goal. We have written to every single synagogue in the country. I've sent an article in 2 forms to every shul in the country to encourage them to put them, to post it on their website or in their newsletters, with the message of please encourage people to tick the box. It's incredibly valuable. So we're doing what we can. We're a small organization with limited budget and limited capacity, but we're doing everything we can to spread the message. And I just encourage others, on listening to this, to help with that message. So if you're talking to friends or family, encourage them to tick this box. It is, as I've said several times now, incredibly important and valuable to do so.
All right, Phil.
Okay, thank you. So Jerry's second question was around the accuracy, I think, of the Muslim figures. I think you may have the full question on your chat. I don't know if you're able to comment on that at all.
Well, I think it's a sort of a similar sort of question. I mean, the Muslim isn't included as a tick box in the ethnicity question either. So the data are based on the religion question. I'm not an expert on Muslim data, so I don't know. I haven't done the work to determine how accurate the numbers actually are. I've done the work on the Jewish population. That's where we have expertise. So they may or may not be more or less accurate than the Jewish population data. But I think on the Jewish issue, which is what I can really speak to, we know that the religion question is extremely effective for British Jews. That's not the case, by the way, for Jews in Hungary, for example, or in Russia, where if you ask a question about religion, you don't pick up anywhere near the proportion you do in Britain. So I think there's a stronger case for asking about Jewishness in different ways in different countries. But in the case of Britain, it works very, very well, and that's why part of our position on this, and part of what we're saying to Office of National Statistics and other agencies is, please, as well as including the ethnicity question, which is fine and legitimate, please include the religion question as well, and indeed use the religion question and the ethnicity question together to create some sort of derived variable where you can really begin to understand ethnic and religious minorities in some detail and depth. So that's that's largely the kind of the message. Yeah.
There's a question from Joe Miller, partly related, but partly not. So I think in your talk you said there were about 10% of Jews that aren't ticking Jewish. Has there been any research done as to why? Is it related to religion rather than ethnicity, as we talked about, or are there other reasons perhaps that people haven't historically completed it?
Yeah, I mean the reasons I think are rather more simplistic, really. One of the issues is around in the Haredi population. One of the issues in 2001 was there was some apprehension about ticking the box, but actually in 2011 the issue was more that the census form only allows space for I think 5 children, and if you have more than that, then you have to ask for a second form. And one of the issues that I think happened in 2011 is that the Haredi population was undercounted a little bit among families that had more than more children than there was space for on the census form. So some of the undercount is due to that. Some of the undercount is due to people not wanting to identify themselves as Jewish at all. They're concerned about that in some way, and that's a legitimate position. I don't think people have really got anything to worry about, but I understand that some people may be concerned about that. But as I said, the decision to not tick the religion box, but to write in Jewish as your ethnicity is actually quite a sophisticated Jewish position to take. It's saying I don't identify as Jewish religiously, but I do strongly identify as Jewish by ethnicity. It's a very small number of people who, in Britain anyway, who take that position. So yes, it increases the number of people. It will increase the number of people in the Jewish population there, but not dramatically so, as I've said. And one of the things I think that we're keen to do as we kind of look at the 2021 census data and the data from Scotland, as I've said, is to monitor whether there are changes in Jewish behaviour around how people respond to the religion question and how people respond to the ethnicity question. Because if there are changes in behaviour, and if we can see that the ethnicity question is starting to work and starting to be of greater importance, then our advice will shift, and it'll shift on the basis of the empirical evidence. So I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully it does.
Thank you. Susanna Wilson's asked, how is the data stored? And what I'm interested in as well is, can anyone access it at any level? I'm sure they can't at any level, but my related question is, what access does the public have, and how much data is available to the public?
Well, it's stored incredibly securely under the standard conditions that any government data are stored. In terms of access to the data, I mean, if you want to play with census data, you can do so. There's a website called NOMIS, NOMIS, and you can go onto it, and you can look around, and you can poke around, and you can ask it to generate all sorts of data tables. Anything that can be put into the public domain is available there, and it's a very useful tool. In order to, I think, to really kind of understand those data and to utilize them for community purposes, you need, I think, a degree of sort of expertise in working with these types of statistics and research methods and statistical methods, etc. But yeah, I mean, in terms of just getting hold of simple counts, how many Jews there are in the country, how the Jewish population breaks down in terms of its socioeconomics or in terms of its age profile, its geographical profile. All of that data is available through that website, and you can play around. I understand that the plan for 2021 is to build a more sophisticated and more interactive tool. I haven't seen what that's going to look like, but I understand that there are plans to do that. So we'll see what happens.
Okay, thank you. So Carly Lessoff has asked, could John explain how ONS used the 2011 census to understand the impact of COVID on the Jewish community?
Yeah, so it's actually like a really, really very extraordinary story. Because as people will know, there was a high. COVID took a high toll on the Jewish population, particularly during the first wave. We saw very high mortality rates among Jews, more so than in the population around them, and particularly high in Manchester, by the way. So there were questions about why did that happen, and our initial assumption was it was probably something to do with the age and the geographical profile. But the Office for National Statistics actually did some extraordinary data linkage work where they took death records and linked them up with census records, something that has just never been done before, to give us some really and give them some really extraordinary insights into what happened, and into what the causes were for behind that mortality. So one of the things that I mean, it's a long story. I don't really have time to go into it. We will be running an event at JPR about our COVID data in the next month or two. But one of the things I think that we can see happening during the pandemic is some really interesting creativity and development around data, use of data, and particularly data around religion. And the Office for National Statistics has really kind of done, as I said, some extraordinary work in that regard. We've been involved a little bit in advising them, and we've been learning a lot from them as well. Yeah, there's been some very interesting stuff going on in that regard.
Right. Is that it, Phil?
Yeah, I think that's the main ones that have come in, and obviously I know we've.
Well, maybe I can ask the last question, and that's: will you be back in 2031? Given the sophistication of government databases and other sources now, will we in the future be relying on sample data and putting it all together rather than having a decennial census?
We don't know is the short answer. Our position on it would certainly be, protect the census because of its extraordinary value, particularly to small populations like the Jewish population. There's nothing like a census. But there's a trend towards use of sort of multiple administrative data sets instead. That's happened in a lot of different countries. The world is moving very rapidly. So I don't know. I can't predict what's going to happen in 2031 at all. We just don't know. But we'll be watching very carefully. We'll be seeing what's possible, what makes sense. We'll be making recommendations. At the end of the day, the Office for National Statistics will make their decisions. I mean, one of the things to bear in mind is that the census is an unbelievably expensive operation. I think it costs about £1 billion now. So there are very real questions about is it an effective use of funds. From a Jewish community perspective, I would just repeat what I've said. It's just completely invaluable. As I said, we've never had anything like it before, and we're, the handful of us who really work in this area are, extraordinarily excited about the release of the 2021 census data. It's going to give us yet another extraordinary picture of the British Jewish community, assuming that everyone ticks the box, and will create all sorts of opportunities. So we're big fans of the census, as I think I probably that's probably come across. But we have to watch this space in terms of what the future holds.
Well, thank you. This session will be available on US TV and the Edgeware US YouTube channel if you wish to view it again or wish to recommend it to others, which I hope you will do, given the importance of the census. You can find many of our past sessions on the Edgeware US YouTube channel, and our current program is on the website www.edgwareu.com. Our next session is on Tuesday, the 23rd of March, 2 days after the census, when Rabbi Cantor Jeffrey Schistler will be cheering us all up 4 days before Pesach with a session entitled A Seder Fit for a King, selections of beautiful Seder music, including some of the world's greatest cantors. It remains for me to thank Dr. Jonathan Boyd for his stimulating and thoroughly researched talk. We are very fortunate to have him and his organisation to provide us with their regular policy-oriented reports, particularly now when the Jewish community will need some form of recovery plan as things begin to return to some form of normal. His leadership will be a great asset in providing the relevant facts, figures, and analysis for communal decision-making. The Jewish community owes a big debt of gratitude to Jonathan for all he has done and will continue to do to keep the community well informed to face the challenges that lie ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Spencer, and thank you also to my team, because it's not me at all. It's I have a whole team of people working with me who are extremely talented. So I just want to extend the thanks to them as well. But thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and tick the box.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to stop the live stream now, but we'll leave it open once I've closed the live stream for a few minutes. So I'm just going to stop that now.
Right.
Okay, right. The live stream has stopped.